I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage.
It's not for nothing that these words form the preface to the 10 Commandments. That's because God's laws are all about undoing the influence of Egypt on the Israelites. Ancient Egypt might seem like a mysterious and sophisticated culture, but at its heart was a dark religion whose ways were in opposition to the ways of God. It's a familiar story. The Israelites had become enslaved in Egypt, so God sent Moses and Aaron to Pharaoh to demand the slaves' release. But Pharaoh defiantly refused. Because of Pharaoh's stubbornness, God sends 10 devastating plagues upon Egypt to get him to change his mind. But in Judaism, they aren't called the 10 plagues. Instead, they're called Eser Hamakot, literally the 10 blows. And this term is the key to what the plagues are all about. As the drama unfolds, we're going to see that the mythology of Egypt is the antithesis to God's blessing on creation. So let's go back to God's very first commandment. Back in the Garden of Eden, God gave our first parents this command:
Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it.
A deliberate and very obvious echo of these words appears in Exodus chapter 1, verse 7.
But the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly, multiplied and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them.
The verbal similarity between these two verses tells us something vital about the role of Israel in God's plan of redemption. So let's explore these verses a little further. The difference between the two verses is, of course, that the first humans were told to fill the earth, whereas the Israelites filled the land. But in Hebrew, the words earth and land are the same word, aretz. So, are these verbal similarities just wordplay? On the contrary, they tell us that the land of Israel will be God's springboard to reach all the peoples of the earth. Israel was to be God's beachhead from which he would spread his word and re-establish his order in the earth. But, as we know, Israel sometimes succeeded and many times failed in this role. Nevertheless, God has never revoked his choice of Israel. This fact is demonstrated in the scriptures in a remarkable way. Throughout the Bible, God is known as the God of heaven and earth, except when the Jews are exiled from their land and scattered abroad. Then he is only known as the God of heaven. Israel's redemptive role in the story of creation is underlined by further verbal similarities. For example, in the first chapter of Genesis, several times we read that God looked on his creation and saw that it was good. In Hebrew, it was good is ki tov. Then we read in Exodus 2 verse 2 that Moses' mother looked on him and saw that he was good. And again, the Hebrew is ki tov. There are also parallel events. In Genesis 7 verses 21 to 23, we learn that the world was destroyed by the waters of a flood, but Noah and his family were saved. And then in Exodus 14 verses 28 to 29, the Egyptian army was destroyed, also by water, this time at the Red Sea, but the Israelites were saved. And one final word connection. In Genesis 7 verse 7, we're told that Noah and his family were saved from the flood waters by entering the ark. In Hebrew, the word for ark is teva. And then in Exodus 2 verse 3, Moses is saved from drowning by being placed in an ark. And there again, the Hebrew word for ark is teva. But let's return to that first echo of Genesis in the Exodus drama. Israel was fruitful and multiplied. Pharaoh was so disturbed by the Israelite baby boom that he first tried slavery to slow the birth rate. When that didn't work, he resorted to genocide. Whether he knew it or not, he was opposing God's blessing on creation as well as God's promise to Abraham. But there was an even more sinister way in which ancient Egypt set itself in opposition to the one true God. To find out what this is, we must once again return to the creation account. Back in Genesis 1 verse 26, God made a wonderful declaration.
Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them.
But the Egyptians corrupted the wonderful truth that we are made in God's image by worshipping demonic spirits in the form of hybrid humans and animals. During ancient Egypt's long history, at times they engaged in human sacrifice, occultic practices in order to manipulate the gods' favor, incest and inbreeding amongst the royal families, and other abominable practices. Many of the laws of the Torah forbade these practices. As has often been said, God didn't only want to get Israel out of Egypt, he wanted to get Egypt out of Israel. So it's no surprise that at one level, each of the plagues was directed against one or more of the Egyptian gods to expose their impotence. We're told as much in Numbers 33 verse 4. On their gods also the Lord executed judgments. And the purpose for doing so? Exodus 7 verse 5 tells us, "And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord." Even back then, God so loved the world. He was working to deliver two groups of people, the Israelites and the Egyptians. In this video, we're going to focus on only one of Egypt's gods, the linchpin without whom the whole false religion comes crashing down. Or should I say, the kingpin. The so-called gods of Egypt included the pharaohs. They were thought of as sons of the gods. They weren't quite equal to the gods, but they derived their power from them. But upon a king's death, he was promoted to full god status. Now there's a position to die for. A mere man elevated to divine status. Now where have we heard that before? Remember what the serpent said to Eve in the garden? "You shall be like God." With those words of the serpent ringing in our ears, it's striking that one of the most pervasive symbols of ancient Egypt was the serpent. In the 1800s, an archaeologist named Gaston Maspero discovered an ancient Egyptian text called the Cannibal Hymn. It was written by a pharaoh named Eunice or Venus, and it contained these remarkable words.
His uraeus serpents are on his brow. Pharaoh's guiding serpent is on his forehead.
The uraeus refers to the snake on the headdress of the Egyptian pharaohs. It's depicted as a spitting cobra, and it's associated with numerous gods and goddesses, also with the afterlife and with resurrection from the dead. But what Israel's God would soon demonstrate is that Pharaoh, the false God-man, had no power over death. In this video, we've looked at scriptures that connect Israel with the original creation. We've also seen how Egyptian mythology is the antithesis of the biblical account of creation. In part 2, we will look at the belief that Pharaoh maintained the very balance of nature. We will learn the meaning of the outstretched arm of God, what the plagues have to do with the original creation, what they have to do with the end of the world, and how they point to the Messiah and a new creation.